I cannot wait to get out of this shirt. It is killing me. Hi everybody, my name is Kelsey and we're about to get very, very nerdy with my favorite books inspired by Jane Austen. So, I think a few years ago maybe, I did a video where I talked about my entire collection of books that were inspired by Jane Austen. Now, this includes things from honestly everything, like if Jane Austen was an inspiration or it's a retelling of one of her books or whatever it is, taking her characters, taking her as a person and revamping a story based on that. It was included. Now, I don't know how up to date that is, but I'll leave it linked above if you want to check it out. But I decided to go through the books that I've actually read and do kind of like a top list. So I was trying to make it top 10. It's top 12 is what we ended up doing. And these are actually ranked. So we're going to start with 12 and move all the way up to 1 as far as like my favorite books that have been inspired by Jane Austen in some way. I don't know about you guys, but for me, like, it's very spring. It's starting to feel like spring now. And when at least for this year, when I think of spring, I think of historical and regency fiction in some way, which Jane Austen obviously falls right into. So not all of these are historical. There's some contemporary in here. There's some mystery in here. It's kind of, there's a sci-fi book in here. It's all over the place. But I thought it would be kind of fun just to talk about some of the books that have been inspired by her or her work that I really enjoyed. This is mostly inspired by a book that I read at the end of last month, March. And so, I don't know, there's just something about it. I just felt like this was a list that I wanted to do. So, here we are. I'm telling you my Jane Austen things that I love. I hope you enjoy. Coming in at number 12 is The Murder of Mr Wickham, and this is by Claudia Gray. This is actually the first in a series. I think there's only 2 out right now, which is Mr Darcy and Miss Tilney. Now, this was not my most favorite thing I've ever read as far as a mystery goes, but this is a mystery where Mr Wickham dies, and people are trying to figure out what happened to him. So, in this world, Mr Knightley and Emma, who are the main 2 characters from Emma by Jane Austen, are hosting a party, and they invite a bunch of their friends, and all their friends happen to be the main characters of all of Jane Austen's other works, except for, I think, one. We have Juliet Tilney, who is the daughter of Catherine and Henry, who are the main characters from Northanger Abbey, so they don't show up, their daughter does, and then the other guy, Jonathan Darcy, is Darcy's oldest son, who obviously is the main character in Pride and Prejudice, but beyond that, everybody else shows up. And they're having this lovely time, and then Wickham shows up. And he is one of the antagonists, if not the antagonist, of Pride and Prejudice. But in this world, the author has created a way where he knows everybody at this party. So he ends up dying at this party, and the 2 kids, Darcy and Tilney, basically take it upon themselves to solve this murder. So the murder elements of it are relatively smaller of a role in this book, but what I loved about this is that this author has taken all of like I said, all these main characters that we have come to love, minus the Tilneys, and have given us a what comes next for them. So it's a lot of it's very, I don't know how to explain it. It's a lot of fun. It's not like the next greatest thing I've ever read, and there's definitely some things that I'm sure Jane Austen fans would read and go, okay, those characters wouldn't do that. But it's a murder mystery, and it's Wickham, and if you are a Pride and Prejudice fan, you probably hate Wickham with all of your guts, so it's fun to have a story where he may or may not get his due. So, I haven't read the second one of this one. I haven't decided if I want to yet or not, but I did really enjoy this one, and it's a fun mystery where you can, like, see all your favorite people again. The next one is a contemporary retelling, and that is Pride, and this is by E.B. Savoy. This is a YA retelling of Pride and Prejudice. This is set in a kind of community that is being gentrified. So I really enjoyed this for lots of reasons. I mean, there's a lot of representation culturally in this book that you wouldn't see in a lot of adaptions, which I loved. It's a YA take, which a lot of the books I'm looking at this list are adult takes on different versions of Pride and Prejudice or different versions of Jane Austen. So you have a YA, which is not as rare in my, or is not as common in my reading, but one of the themes in Pride and Prejudice is the financial gap and difference and status between our main two characters. And when you modernize it, that is one of the themes that is not talked about a lot, because yes, even though finances play a big part in a lot of our couples and a lot of our adaptations of this, it's not a big part. It's not a big theme for people. It's one of the ones that they kind of are like, we're just going to ignore that one. And in this one, they don't do that because, again, like I said, it's about a community that is being gentrified, and the Darcys move in to said gentrified area, and our Lizzie character is the one who already lives there. And so there's a lot of conversation about the cultural and financial differences between the two of them. So I really enjoyed it for that reason, because like I said, it's a take on a story that I love, but they've done it in a very different way that I haven't seen before. Plus, it's a fun YA book, and I just liked all of the representation that we saw in this book. It was just a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed it. The next one is actually kind of like two together because it's representative of the entire series. It's a trilogy. I've only read the first two, which is why these are the only two on here, but that is Pride and Premeditation and Sense and Second Degree Murder, which are both part of the Jane Austen murder mystery series by Tiers Price. So the first one, Pride and Prejudice and Premeditation, obviously is a murder mystery retelling of Pride and Prejudice. This one obviously is Sense and Sensibility, and the third one I believe is called Manslaughter Park, and so obviously that one is a reimagining of, I almost called it Mansfield Park. So these are YA retellings that are very loosely inspired by our main characters. So we have all of our main characters that you would expect in Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, but very, very different. So for example, this is the one that is the main one on this list. I didn't enjoy this one nearly as much as Pride and Premeditation, so if you're going to go with one, I would choose this one. Also, it's the first one in the series. Not that they have to do with anything, it's literally just a series of reimaginings, so none of them have to do with the other one. But in this world, we have Lizzie, whose father is a lawyer, and Lizzie really, really wants to be a litigator, and so there is this murder mystery that like shocks the world, and she's like, this is my chance. And the person who's being accused is Bingley. However, he already happens to have a lawyer, which is Darcy, and so she kind of goes about trying to solve this mystery because she's like, it's not you, I know it's not you. And so she and Darcy unwittingly multiple times end up trying to solve this mystery and figure out who did it. And it's them solving this mystery. And then in Sense and Second Degree Murder, I don't remember exactly what this one's about. Our two sisters, Eleanor, who wants to be a scientist, and Mary Ann, who worked with her father. Her father was a kind of like private investigator, and he ends up dying at the beginning of this book, which is true for this Sense and Sensibility story. And the two of them team up because they don't think it was just like a heart attack. They think it's something else is going on there. So it's the two sisters trying to solve that murder mystery. So I really like these because you get to see lots of hints. It's not obviously a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, but and Sense and Sensibility, but it has a lot of the characters from these stories that you like, with a fun kind of ridiculous murder mystery element to it. You kind of have to go in with a little bit of suspense of disbelief, but otherwise I really enjoyed these. The next one on this list is one that I still think very, very highly of, but it is not my most favorite, which is why it's so much lower on this list. But if I remember correctly, it was my very first reimagining of a Jane Austen story, and that is Eligible by Curtis Sittenfeld, which is a reimagining of Pride and Prejudice. This is a modern adaptation. It follows kind of a little bit, if you like The Bachelor and that kind of story and that kind of show, I think you would enjoy this because it has elements of that. So you've got a lot of the same things of like the sisters, the five sisters, the mother wanting to marry them off, that kind of thing. This book starts with their father having a health scare, so both Jane and Lizzie come back home to Cincinnati to kind of like be around, and her mother is in like a tizzy because Jane's about to turn 40 and isn't married and is freaking out. And this guy, who is named Chip Bingley, comes into town, and he is kind of famous because he was on a reality dating show. And so he comes into town, and it's that situation. And obviously his best friend is Darcy, and they don't get along. And it's a very, very similar plot structure to Pride and Prejudice. It's been a very long time since I read this. I do remember there being a trans character in this story, and I do not know if it was handled well because it's been so long. So go in with a grain of salt when it comes to that, because I remember something very specific about that, and I do not remember how it was handled. But as far as a retelling goes, it was the first one I've seen. I liked all the characters. It's an adult retelling, but if I remember correctly, there's not a whole lot of smut in it, which is good. But it's got the Bachelor vibes, which I kind of enjoyed. And this was kind of one of the first books that I'd read that included a Bachelor style show. Now, they're not on this show. He just happens to have been on in the past. And that's why he's a doctor, but that's why he's kind of like famous and everyone notices him now, is because he had gone on the show. So it's all of the fun stuff you expect from Pride and Prejudice. You just stick it in today's world, and I enjoyed it. The next one is another YA. I'm actually now realizing that I have way more YA on this list than I thought it was. And that is Being Mary Bennett. And this is by J.C. Peterson. This one is one that is not a retelling. There are elements to the story that are similar plot structure-wise to Pride and Prejudice. But the idea behind this is that we follow our main character, Marnie Barnes, who is the middle sister of 5 siblings. And she is very, I would say, judgmental on some things, and one of her friends in a fight basically tells her that she's the Mary Bennett, and she's like, no, that's not, how could you say that? I'm a leading lady. And then she kind of rethinks her life. So it's a little bit of a coming of age. She is in high school. I think she is, I don't remember how old she is, but she's older high school. I think she's starting to think about like college and that sort of thing. And there is a romance between her and this guy who runs a animal shelter, and she's doing a project with this guy. And so it is not at all a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, but all of the siblings have the same initials as the siblings from Pride and Prejudice. And like I said, there is a character that is very clearly a reimagining of Wickham. So you get this story, but it's really this girl kind of like taking on her own. So if you like Jane Austen and you want some hints towards Jane Austen, this is a really good book to read, but it's not a retelling by any stretch of the imagination. But I really enjoyed it. There is a second book that is, it's not a series, but it does follow one of her younger sisters, Lydia, she's the Lydia character. Her name is Lola, and it's called Lola at Last, which I still haven't read, but I really want to. And I don't know, she's a perfectionist, and she's being forced to figure stuff out. And she thought she had to be one way her entire life, and she's kind of figuring out what that means for her. I really enjoyed this one. The next one is an entire series that is kind of slotted for this one spot, and that is the Rajay series by Sonalia Dev, which I devoured. The first one is Pride and Prejudice and Other Flavors, obviously inspired by Pride and Prejudice. We have Recipe for Persuasion, inspired by Persuasion. We have In Sense and Sensibility, inspired by Sense and Sensibility. And then the final book, The Emma Project, which obviously is inspired by Emma. Now, this world, basically we follow one family, and it's the Rajay family, and each book in this series follows someone within that family, whether it's a sibling, whether it's a cousin, whatever. But the Rajays are an Indian American family that comes from royalty, so they are ridiculously rich. And so each story tackles something different. This one, our main character is Trisha. She's a doctor, and she loves what she does, but she doesn't think her dad thinks very highly of her. She falls for Baker, who is mixed but on the darker skinned side, so you have conversations of culture as well as financial differences in that one. This one follows one of the cousins who goes on a dating show with her ex. Is a second chance romance of sorts. If I can figure out when I read these, I'll leave the wrap up above, but there are so many trigger warnings for this one specifically, but this one was my favorite. Then we have In Sense and Sensibility, which follows one of the sons, Yash, who is running for Congress. He's running for governor, and he ends up being involved in a shooting, and so he goes to this yoga place with one of his ex-girlfriends, I think it's an ex-girlfriend, who is trying to help him through kind of the PTSD behind that. And then we have the Emma Project, which out of all of these is the smuttiest of them, although I wouldn't consider any of these smutty by any stretch of the imagination. And this one follows Nina and Vonch. Vonch is one of the siblings, and she is trying to start up this company that's supposed to help women in healthcare. And he kind of is trying to get a grant, and he comes in and tries to steal the grant from her, and it's all about women in STEM. So each one of these has, like I said, a conversation about culture, about different situations that are going on in our characters' lives. But as you can tell, these are all very loosely based on books by Jane Austen. They are not direct like retellings of them, in the sense of, like, for example, in like a Pride and Prejudice retelling, you would expect that halfway through we're going to get a proposal that's rejected, and it's things like that. That's not exactly what happens, but a lot of the themes are similar, and you can see that there's a lot of hints to characters and places in these books, which I loved. I binged the first 3 books in a weekend, which I do not do, and then I had to wait for this one because it wasn't out yet. So I really enjoyed this. It's a very different look at our stories. It's a very different cultural look as well. I really enjoyed seeing the family dynamic because it's very different in these. But this is a series that I just really enjoyed and is good if you want just a nice, fun. Actually, this is really good if you want a romance that has a lot more substance to it. The next one's for my sci-fi fans, because I have one book on here that's a sci-fi, and that is the Jane Austen Project, and this is by Catherine A. Flynn. This is a time travel story, but it does take place mostly in the past. We follow our 2 main characters, Rachel and Liam, who go back to England in 1815. They are researchers from the very technology advanced future, and their goal is to go back and befriend and steal from Jane Austen. And they pose as a doctor and his sister to befriend Austen. And it is that friendship that grows. There's some trippy stuff that, you know, about the time and how things work. They become really connected to Jane as a person, and so betraying her is very hard for them. Things like that. But it's mainly takes place in the past. It just has a lot of future conversations. So I liked the world that was built in this book. I thought it was really interesting. And like I said, it's for the sci-fi people who like all of the technology stuff, because while it's not a huge part of this story, it is talked a lot about. And I really enjoyed seeing something that was a complete departure from anything I've read as far as being inspired by Jane Austen, because you get your murder mysteries, you get your, you know, contemporary retellings, you get your historical retellings, but it's very rare that you'll get a sci-fi. So I really enjoyed this one. Again, this was probably one of the ones that I read in my first like few years here on YouTube, but for my sci-fi fans, you'll enjoy that one, I think. The next one is for my hardcore Pride and Prejudice fans, and that is Longbourn, and this is by Jo Baker. This is a reimagining of the story of Pride and Prejudice from one of the maids' perspectives in Longbourn, which is the house that the Bennets grew up in. This one was all inspired, if I remember what the author's note said, was entirely inspired by one singular line, 2 singular lines from Pride and Prejudice. One of them mentioned this maid, and one of them mentioned a valet that comes in at one point, and then we never hear from him again. So this author said, okay, what is the logic behind this? Who is this maid, and who is this guy that was showed up once and disappeared? So that's what she's done. She's taken the story of this maid, and like I said, it's all in her perspective, and it's about Longbourn when they get a new valet, and who the heck he is, and what's going on with him. So it's definitely some mysterious elements. It's written very similarly, in my opinion, to Jane Austen, so it does have lean towards the classic writing style, so be wary of that, but it was really interesting to see this story. And like, it is the events of Pride and Prejudice and after, before and after the events of Pride and Prejudice, from someone who is basically invisible in this world. I kept saying valet, and he's a footman, so sorry. But he arrives under mysterious circumstances and then disappears. So I just thought it was a really interesting story based on quite literally 2 or 3 singular lines from the original text. And it's just a fun, interesting way to look at the story from like an outsider's perspective. All right, we're now into like the top 5. Well, we've been in the top 5, but we're now in like the top of the top. And this one is for my middle grade fans, and that is I Speak Boy, and this is by Jessica Brody, and this is a reimagining very loosely inspired by Emma, which I will admit is not my favorite book by her. I find Emma kind of one of the more boring, if you will, by Jane Austen, but I loved this idea, because Emma is all about matchmaking, and matchmaking that goes terribly wrong. And so in this book, our main character, Em, is trying to matchmake her friend Harper, and it turns out that the guy that she's trying to matchmake with, Harper, is actually interested in Emma, and it just kind of goes terribly wrong. And so because of that, she wakes up one day, looks at her phone, and the app that used to be on her phone for translation is now called I Speak Boy. And it basically is an app that if it's open around a male, boy, adult, man, doesn't matter, if they identify as male, it'll take what they're saying and translate what they mean. And so because of that, Emma is able to, or Em, I think she goes by Em in this book, Emmy, so sorry. Emmy is able to kind of help some couples in this school get together. It's very like boy crazy. I read this and went, oh my gosh, that was me in middle school, because I was definitely very boy crazy in middle school. But it was really interesting to read this, because I feel like if you are younger and you are reading middle grade because you're in middle school, you'll relate to a lot of the stuff that's happening in here. If you're older, you'll look back like me and go, oh God, I relate to a lot of the stuff in here, because that's what I was like when I was in middle school. So it's very interesting. It has a lot of elements that bring the story together, but this idea of like an iTranslate app that is there to help the girls figure out what the heck the boys mean, loved it. I loved the idea behind that. And then of course, Emmy is all about ignoring her own story and trying to figure out that as well. I just really liked it. You don't have to know Emma to go into this one. It's definitely a book that holds its own without having the Emma story. It's just very loosely inspired by that, and I loved it. I rated it super highly. I'm pretty sure I gave it a 5-star. Oh, I forgot, I also have it signed, which is fun. So I loved it. I definitely will reread this. It's definitely one that I'm going to keep around for a very long time. It was so good. The next one is the only one that I don't physically own, and this is The Heiress by Molly Greeley, which is The Revelations of Anne de Bourgh. And this is a adaptation, or a reimagining of Anne de Bourgh, who is a very small side character in Pride and Prejudice. So in the original story of Pride and Prejudice, Catherine de Bourgh, her mother, plays a pretty big role in a lot of stuff, and Anne is just kind of written off as her sickly daughter. And she always thought that Anne would marry Darcy, their cousins, and she was always like, yep, Anne and Darcy are going to be together, that's just how it is. And so in this story, we get basically Anne's entire life, and I don't remember exactly, I know there's a couple of trigger warnings in here, but I do remember specifically drug abuse, because Anne just kind of like floats through life very willy-nilly, doesn't have, I don't think she says anything in Pride and Prejudice. I think she's literally just there in the background. And in this book, the author presents it as a what if she was getting laudanum really young and then basically got addicted. And so it's this, there is a female-female romance in this, which I loved, because I don't see that a lot in, well, Regency stories to begin with. I know there's definitely some out there that have become more popular here lately, but most Regency romances are still very hetero and straight. So it was really interesting to see that romance. I liked the ideas of this story. It's a very interesting look on Anne as a character, and kind of giving someone who has basically no role in the original book a story and her life and what that means, and you know, how she would react when she finds out that this person, Darcy, that she has basically been told her entire life she's going to marry, ends up marrying somebody else. And so how they relate, I don't know, I loved it. I loved a lot of it. The ending was beautiful. I cried at the end of this book. So it's definitely one of the more thought-provoking ones, I would say, and one of the more deeper subject matter-wise, but I loved it. I loved it. It was so good. All right, the next one is the one that kind of inspired this entire idea, which is The Other Bennett Sister by Janice Hadlow. Like I mentioned at the very beginning, I read this at the end of March and loved it. So this is a reimagining of Mary Bennett, who's the middle sister, who is the forgotten sister in Pride and Prejudice. A lot of these are Pride and Prejudice. I'm now realizing I should probably branch out beyond just Pride and Prejudice stuff, but here we are. This one I loved, because I love Mary as a character because she's given like almost no characteristics except for being the plain middle sister who is really studious, wears glasses, and plays the piano. Like, she's giving almost nothing as far as character wise. And because of that, I find retellings and reimaginings of her story really interesting. The problem is that people in the past, I've read retellings that have taken her story and basically like made it fan fiction and like forced her to be with like Darcy, for example, and felt like that was an appropriate relationship when I don't think that would physically happen. Like, Mary and Darcy are so different. He would not take her as a wife or a lover or anything like that. So this is what I wanted all of the Mary retellings to be, because it's written very, very similarly to Jane Austen's writing style. Not identical, but there are so many characteristics that this author, you could tell, studied the crap out of Jane Austen's writing when she was writing this. But also, like, she took the character of Mary and she did obviously like revamp it and make it much more of a well-rounded character because we're given so little, but she didn't discard the little we were given. She kind of gave a backstory to it. And Mary really comes into her own here, and there is a love story in this one. I don't know, I just loved every second of it. So if you're looking for a retelling of Mary's story, right here. So I definitely want to look into other things by this author. I don't know if they have anything else. I feel like they're a historian, but I feel like I also may have made that up. Hold on. Yeah, she graduated with a degree in history. So she's written some biographies and things like this, and this is her first novel. So I'm definitely keeping my eyes out to see if there's other things by this author, because this is what I wanted every other retelling I've read to be, and I finally got it, and it was so good. So coming in at number 1, I feel like if you've been here for any stretch of time, if you've been here in like the last couple of years, this one probably will not surprise you, because when I read it, I could not stop gushing about it. And to this day, it still remains one of my favorite retellings or reimaginings of something inspired by Jane Austen. And that is The Missing Manuscripts of Jane Austen by Scribd James. Scribd James has a lot of different books. She also has the Lost Memoirs of Jane Austen, which I did read and enjoy. It just wasn't one of my favorites. And she's done a lot of other books. Like, I have a few books on my shelf that like are inspired by the Bronte sisters. And she just takes these like classic women writers and gives them stories. This one is basically, we follow a woman named Samantha who is in England, and she ends up buying this poetry book from like a charity shop or a used bookstore or something like that, and is reading it and realizes that in the back there's tucked a few pages, and it's an unfinished letter that Jane Austen wrote to her sister Cassandra, kind of possibly hinting at the fact that there might be a manuscript that she started writing and hid somewhere and it's never been published. And so she finally kind of goes down the rabbit hole, figures out what the house is that this manuscript could be at, approaches the guy who owns this house, and they end up searching the entire house and finding the manuscript. That all happens in the first, like, 100 pages. This book is primarily the actual manuscript, so it's not only is it a story of Samantha and this guy finding this book, and then there are breaks in between the manuscript where they kind of, like, take breaks and talk about what they've read, but then you have this actual manuscript part, which is probably 75 to 80% of this book. And I loved it because it feels very Austen-esque. There is writing and characteristics of the writing that are very similar. Obviously, this author studied the crap out of Jane Austen as well to kind of get those characteristics down. But also, like, this is presented as one of her first finished manuscripts before she started writing everything else that got turned into books. So in this book, you can see like beginnings of characters, or characters that were very clearly inspired by other Austen characters that is presented as possibly the first draft of that character. And I just really enjoyed it because not only do you get a whole new story that feels like an Austen story, but then you also get a side story where these characters are finding this manuscript and it's the two of them possibly falling in love over it. But everything about this was good. I think I physically read this. I don't think I had the audiobook of this, but I might be wrong. But I think I physically read this, and I remember sitting in that chair and I read it over the course of like a couple of days. Like, it took over my life. I literally could not put it down. So yes, this to this day is still my favorite Austen inspired thing, period. I will rave about it. I will rave about this author. I will talk about it all the time. And if you are at all an Austen fan, I think you will enjoy this story. It's just so good. It's just so good. And I kind of want to reread it, to be honest, because it's been a couple of years since I've read it. And I just want that feeling back, you know? So that is a list of my top 12 books that are, or series, that are inspired by Jane Austen in some way. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you are Austen fans, if you're not Austen fans, maybe you got some fun, interesting, new books to add to your TBR, let me know. But if you are an Austen fan and you have some reimaginings or books that are inspired by Jane Austen that you loved, please let me know. I've read so many that this list could have been in like the 20s or 30s, I think, but I tried to narrow it down to like my favorites. So if you have any favorites, please let me know, because I am always looking for more things inspired by Jane Austen. You guys know I love this author. She is one of, if not my favorite author of all time. So anything remotely inspired by her, or anything remotely compared to a book by her, I want to consume. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up and subscribe down below if you'd like to be part of this awesome growing family. I also got my social media down there, as well as other fun bookish links, so don't forget to check all that out, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!